What if, right now, the exact traits that you were taught make you a quote-unquote good person are the problem?
Ooh, that is a loaded question.
Right. But think about it. Unquestioning loyalty to your family, standing in absolute solidarity with your community, trusting your leaders to handle all the complex decisions.
The societal glue.
Exactly, the glue. But what if those exact psychological mechanisms are actually what causes human civilizations to completely collapse?
I mean, it is a profoundly uncomfortable thought because we are hardwired biologically and socially to view loyalty as the ultimate virtue.
Yeah, we really are.
It is the foundation of human interaction. But from a structural standpoint, like from a pure sociological standpoint, blind loyalty is often the rust that just eats away at the steel of a society.
And that tension, that exact friction right there, is what we are diving into today. Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one. It's going to be intense.
It really is, because usually when we talk about a structural collapse, like a bridge falling or a skyscraper giving way, there's this expectation of a visible, sudden failure.
Right, the catastrophic event.
Yeah, you see the steel beam snap or the concrete shatter, and the structural engineer just points at the rubble and says, there it is. That's the stress point.
It's measurable. It's binary.
Yeah.
Broken or not broken.
Which is deeply comforting, honestly. We like things to be visible. We want them neatly categorized and easily diagnosed.
Absolutely.
No.
We want to know exactly why the structure couldn't hold the weight so we can, fix it for next time.
Right.
But human societies do not operate on the physics of steel and concrete.
No, they definitely don't.
They operate on the physics of human psychology.
And that is a diagnostic landscape that is just incredibly murky. The stress points in a civilization aren't physical materials. They are invisible social contracts.
They're loyalties.
Right. And today, we are stepping firmly into the roles of master sociologists and systems engineers. We are going to dissect one of the most fascinating ancient manuals on civilizational survival ever written.
It's a brilliant text.
We are looking at a specific foundational text, Surah Al-Ankabut, verses 8 through 15.
But before we go any further, we really need to establish the ground rules for how we are analyzing this text today.
Yeah, that's crucial for you listening, because this isn't what you might expect.
We are entirely stripping away the standard, sentimental, purely religious lens. We are not doing theology today.
Not at all.
We are treating this as a highly sophisticated treatise on social engineering. It's about human psychology and the raw structural mechanics of how societies either adapt and survive or stagnate and face terminal collapse.
So let me set the stage for you listening right now. The goal here is to extract the raw data from this text. The text is actively trying to, the best way to say it is harden the agent.
I love that phrasing. Hardening the agent.
Right. It's treating the individual human being as an agent in a massive, multi-generational system. And to prepare that agent for a long, costly project of civilizational reform, it demands intellectual sharpness over blind tradition.
And to do that, the text has to systematically dismantle the loyalty above all myth.
It just takes a sledgehammer to it.
It really does. It takes two massive, almost biological societal pressures, family loyalty and crisis loyalty, and forcefully subordinates them to verified principles.
So let's start with that first biological pressure, because honestly, it is the hardest one to shake.
It's the origin point.
It is the origin point of all our loyalties. Verse 8 of this text goes straight for the jugular. It addresses the ultimate sacred cow of human society, which is unconditional obedience to parents.
And the mandate presented here is incredibly nuanced yet razor sharp.
How so?
Well, it states that you must honor your parents. You must treat them with absolute physical and emotional care. But, and this is a massive but, if they strive to make you associate unverified concepts with ultimate truth.
What the text calls associating without knowledge.
Exactly. If they do that, you are commanded not to obey them.
Wait, hold on. Let me play devil's advocate here. If you tell an entire generation to intellectually rebel against their parents, don't you just invite total anarchy?
It sounds like it, right?
I mean, from an evolutionary perspective, tribal survival required absolute cohesion. If every teenager thinks they are some revolutionary smashing their parents' ideologies, how does a society maintain any sort of order?
That is the exact paradox early human societies faced. And it is why this text is proposing what amounts to a radical software update for human civilization.
The software update, I like that.
You are absolutely right that in ancient tribal hunter-gatherer societies, or even early agrarian ones, obedience to the elders was biologically necessary for survival.
Because they knew where the predators were.
Right. If the elder said, don't eat that berry or don't go into that valley, and you disobeyed just to figure it out for yourself, you died.
You didn't have time for a peer-reviewed study on the berry.
Exactly. The tribe couldn't afford intellectual independence. Cohesion meant survival. Schism meant death.
So obedience was literally hardwired into our amygdala. The giant humans who feed us and protect us from predators must possess the ultimate truth, otherwise we perish.
Precisely. From infancy, physical dependence and intellectual dependence are entirely fused together.
They're one and the same to a kid.
When you are a toddler, you have no independent verified knowledge. Your parents are your source of food, your safety, and your reality.
If they tell you the sky is green, your survival depends on nodding along.
They embed their ideologies, their superstitions, and their prejudices into your mind long before you have the cognitive defense mechanisms to question them.
You are a sponge without a filter.
Which explains why it is so agonizingly difficult for adults to separate emotional care from intellectual independence later in life.
We feel like disagreeing with our parents' worldview is somehow a betrayal of their love.
And that feeling of betrayal is exactly what the text is trying to short-circuit. It introduces a brilliant sociological shift.
Okay, break that shift down for us.
It demands physical and emotional care for aging parents, but it completely severs the obligation of intellectual obedience.
That is a massive distinction.
It is.
Yeah.
If you look at the wider context of this societal framework, there's this fascinating parallel note in another part of the source material, Surah Israel, which provides an incredibly empathetic analysis of the cognitive decline of the elderly.
Oh, right, the part about not showing contempt.
Yes. It notes that when parents reach old age, when their memory fades, when they become irritable or say irrational things, you shouldn't even say a word of contempt to them. You don't scold them.
So you provide for their physical needs, and you protect their emotional dignity.
Exactly.
But you do not owe them your operating system.
That's the perfect way to phrase it.
I mean, just because you respect the original developers of a system, the people who wrote the first lines of code for your life, doesn't mean you keep running an obsolete, buggy operating system when the environment changes.
You have to upgrade.
You have to.
It is the difference between biological preservation and civilizational progression. The text is arguing that when you reach adulthood, when you acquire your own cognitive capacity, a separation must occur.
You have to evaluate the data you are given.
Yes. If your parents are pushing you toward irrationality, toward systems that lack evidence, which again is what associating without knowledge means in a systemic context, the text commands intellectual rebellion paired with physical compassion.
Let's look at how human history has actually grappled with this, because there are two distinct civilizational models that illustrate this perfectly.
I know exactly where you're going with this.
Let's call them the Ram paradigm and the Abraham paradigm.
Perfect. The Ram tradition is a classic example of what traditional cohesion-focused societies revere.
Right.
In the cultural narrative of Ram, his father, due to a highly manipulative promise made to his stepmother, asks his eldest, most capable son to step down as the rightful heir to the kingdom and go into exile in the jungle.
And Ram, out of absolute, unquestioning, blind obedience to his father, just accepts it.
He just walks away.
He gives up the kingdom and goes to live in the forest. Now, traditionally, that is lauded as the highest possible virtue. It's seen as the ultimate self-sacrifice for parental authority.
And it was necessary for the tribal cohesion we just talked about. In that ancient context, Ram stepping down prevented a civil war within the ruling family. It maintained the peace.
But from a mature systems perspective.
From a systems perspective, the text we are analyzing views that paradigm as an unreasonable, irrational demand that ultimately destabilizes society.
Because you're losing your best leader.
Exactly. It deprives the society of its rightful, most capable leadership merely to satisfy a flawed, emotional vow made by an aging patriarch. It is the ultimate victory of biological hierarchy over systemic reason.
Now contrast that with the text's ultimate model of the hardened agent. The Abraham paradigm.
Abraham represents the radical software update. He lived in a society where his father wasn't just a participant in a flawed system, his father was the manufacturer of the system.
He literally carved the idols.
Yes, the physical representations of unverified concepts, the very things the entire society worshipped and organized its economy around.
So he was basically the CEO of the local ideology factory. He was the establishment.
And Abraham didn't just quietly disagree to keep the peace at the dinner table.
He didn't just smile and nod.
No, He rationally, systematically, and publicly challenged his father's business and ideology because it violated intellectual truth.
He pointed out the systemic absurdity of worshiping a piece of wood you just carved with your own hands.
Abraham prioritized the verified principle over the biological bond. He looked at the code his father wrote, realized it was corrupted, and refused to run it.
But let me push back on that for a second. Why is it so necessary to publicly break the code?
What do you mean?
I mean, why couldn't Abraham just play along for the sake of social harmony while privately holding his verified principles? Why force the conflict?
Because if an entire society just mimics its ancestors, it stagnates.
It's just a loop.
It's evolutionary biology applied to sociology. In biology, species that solely rely on past behaviors, that fail to adapt to new environmental stressors, go extinct. They become obsolete.
And human societies are exactly the same.
True reverence for the past isn't endlessly repeating it, it's building upon it. If you only ever trace your parents' footsteps, you aren't on a path of progress. You are in a holding pattern.
And in a changing world, a holding pattern is the death of human potential.
Exactly. Extinction by stagnation.
Okay, so we've established that the individual has to break the biological chain of blind loyalty to parents. We have to separate physical compassion from intellectual obedience.
Right. That's step one.
But let's be real. Even if someone achieves that massive intellectual independence at home, they step out the front door and immediately hit a much bigger, much more intimidating wall.
The crowd.
The crowd, society at large. How does the text handle the pressure of the masses?
This is where we transition from the pressure of the family to the pressure of society, diving into verses 10 and 11.
And this is where it gets really diagnostic.
It does. The text addresses a very specific psychological phenomenon. People will claim they believe in the verified principle. They will say, I have evaluated the data, I am on board, I am part of the movement for reform.
They talk a big game.
But then they face what the text calls fitnat alnas.
Fitnat alnas, the trial or the pressure of the people.
And their reaction is incredibly telling. The text says they treat the pushback of society as if it is a terminal punishment from God. And they immediately fold.
They just collapse.
They abandon the principle the second the crowd turns on them.
We really need to work the diagnostic verbs here because the terminology is brilliantly precise. The word fitna originally refers to the smelting process, doesn't it?
Yes, the metallurgical process.
Yeah.
It is the intense heat used by a metal worker to melt down ore and separate the pure gold from the dross and impurities.
So it is a violent, necessary stress test.
Exactly. It's meant to burn away what isn't real.
But these waverers, when they face fitnat al-nas, which could be social friction, loss of status, economic pushback, being canceled on social media, or just a bit of mockery at a dinner party.
They treat that friction as if it is the ultimate unsurvivable catastrophe.
They use the social cost as an immediate, justified excuse to defect from the principle.
And the sociological insight the text provides here is just devastating.
What is it?
Conviction that collapses under the very first social cost was never conviction to begin with.
Wow.
It was merely a fair weather preference. It was a luxury belief.
A luxury belief. I think about that concept a lot. You only hold the belief when it costs you absolutely nothing.
It's a status symbol.
You wear it when the weather is nice, but the moment the invoice arrives for holding that belief, you declare moral bankruptcy.
And this text provides an absolutely brilliant linguistic and sociological analogy to explain the mechanics of this type of person.
Oh, this is my favorite part of the analysis.
It delves into the physical origin of the Arabic root for the word hypocrite, which is munafiq.
This is one of the most vivid metaphors I have ever come across. Walk us through the biology of this.
Well, the environment shapes the language. The Arabs were a desert people, and their linguistic roots are deeply tied to survival in that harsh landscape.
Right, everything is about surviving the elements.
So the root of munafiq is connected to the word nafiq, which relates to a very specific, highly evolved survival strategy of a desert mouse, the jerboa.
The jerboa. Okay, how does the mouse build its home?
When the jerboa digs its burrow in the sand, it creates an obvious, highly visible main entrance. It goes deep down, builds its nest, stores its food.
Seems normal so far.
But it doesn't stop there. It carefully digs a secondary tunnel leading up toward the surface, away from the main entrance.
Okay.
But crucially, it doesn't break through the surface. It leaves a very thin, invisible crust of sand at the top. This hidden secondary exit is the nafiq.
So to anyone walking by, or to any other mouse in the burrow, it looks like a normal, committed home with one way in.
Precisely. It looks like absolute commitment. But if a predator, a snake, or a desert fox comes in through the main entrance, The mouse doesn't stay and defend the nest.
It just bails.
It simply runs up the hidden tunnel, busts through that paper-thin crust of sand, and escapes into the desert. It builds an exit strategy into its home from the very beginning.
Let's translate this to human psychology, because this is the ultimate tell of a modern hypocrite.
It really is.
It's the person who joins a movement, signs a social contract, gets married, or takes a job at a company, but builds a psychological hidden exit strategy into their commitment from day one.
It is the illusion of loyalty masking pure, unadulterated self-preservation.
When the environment is safe, they are down in the burrow with everyone else.
They are loud advocates for the cause. They are talking about shared goals, quoting verified principles, enjoying the warmth and safety of the community.
But the moment the predator arrives, the moment fitnat al-nas occurs,
When the cultural tide turns.
or their job is threatened, or the movement requires actual painful sacrifice, they don't stay and fight for the principle.
They punch through the hidden exit and vanish.
And everyone else is left in the burrow wondering what happened to their strongest ally.
This is why verse 11 synthesizes this dynamic so perfectly. It states that the ultimate system of truth surely knows those who believe and surely knows the hypocrites.
The assayer knows.
Right. The pressure of society isn't a bug in the system. It is a feature. The fitnat al-nas is the necessary smelting fire.
It is the stress test that separates the true believers from the desert mice. Without the pressure, everyone looks like a loyal agent.
You only find out who built the nafik when the snake enters the burrow.
That is terrifying because it asks us to look at our own lives. I mean, you're probably feeling this right now listening to this. We all are.
It's universally applicable.
You vote, you protest, you post online, you support a cause. But are you truly committed, or have you left a thin layer of sand at the top of your commitment just in case things get too difficult?
It forces brutal self-honesty. It really does.
But the text doesn't let us stop at self-reflection. It scaled up the challenge.
Because it's not just about individual failure.
Exactly. We've seen how individuals use social pressure as an excuse to abandon principle. But what happens when the society itself, the actual power structure, actively tries to buy your loyalty?
What happens when the elites make you an offer you supposedly can't refuse?
This brings us to the third major structural pillar of this deep dive.
The fraud of liability transfer, covering verses 12 and 13. And this is where the text just systematically dismantles the propaganda of the elite.
The societal elites, the power brokers, the people who control the resources and the narratives, make an incredibly seductive offer to the masses.
What's the pitch?
They say, follow our way. Adopt our corrupt system, do what we say, and we will carry your sins. We will bear the burden of your actions.
Do the dirty work for us, and we'll cover the moral and legal fees.
It is an offer of total indemnification.
It is the ultimate civilizational Ponzi scheme. That's exactly what it is. But the text instantly, categorically refutes this offer.
It shuts it down immediately.
It does. The elites will carry their own loads and other loads with their own, but absolutely no one bears another's account.
Meaning accountability in a rational universe is strictly non-transferable.
Non-transferable.
I really want to spend time unpacking this because this concept of non-transferable accountability is massive. There is a specific socioeconomic term for this in the broader analytical framework, right?
Yes, mukafade amal, the law of requital.
What is the actual mechanism of this law? Because it's not magic.
Mukafade amal is the engine of causality. It is vital to understand that this is not a theological mood swing.
Right, it's not a guy in the sky getting mad.
It is not a deity sitting on a cloud deciding to be angry on Tuesday and forgiving on Wednesday. It is a rigid structural law of the universe, as inescapable as gravity or thermodynamics.
Every action has a systemic consequence.
If you put your hand in a fire, the biology of your skin reacts to the heat and it burns. You cannot pay someone else to take the burn for you.
But that is exactly what the elites are promising.
They're selling a lie.
They are essentially trying to sell fire insurance after they've convinced you to burn the house down. They are saying, hey, ignore those verified principles you know are true. Follow our exploitative economic system, our corrupt political machinery, and when the consequences arrive, we will step in front of the bullet for you.
And the text reveals this as a mathematical impossibility. Sociologically, no leader, no political party, no billionaire class can absorb the systemic consequences of the masses' bad decisions.
Let's look at a modern historical equivalent to make this concrete for the listener. Look at the 2008 financial crisis.
That is the perfect analogy.
The entire global economy was built on a massive liability transfer scheme.
Exactly. You had the financial elites creating these incredibly complex, toxic financial instruments,
Yeah.
collateralized debt obligations, subprime mortgages,
Stuff they knew was garbage.
and they went to the masses and essentially said, take out these loans you can't afford. Participate in this hyperinflated housing market. Follow our way.
Don't worry about the underlying economic reality. The rating agencies say it's fine.
We have absorbed the risk. We will carry the burden.
And the public willingly participated because they wanted the short-term reward.
They wanted the house.
And they believed the elites had fundamentally altered the law of economic gravity. They thought the liability had been successfully transferred.
But mukafati amal, the law of cause and effect, cannot be bypassed by a clever financial derivative.
The math always catches up.
The toxic assets were still toxic. The rot was in the system. And when the housing market collapsed, who actually paid the price? Did the elites absorb the burn?
Of course not. The elites got bailed out by the government. The executives kept their bonuses.
And what happened to the masses?
The individual citizens, the masses who participated in the system, they lost their homes, their pensions, their life savings, their jobs. The liabilities slammed right back into the individuals who participated.
The elites might face some abstract historic tribunal, or face the rot in their own isolated ways, hence the text saying they carry other loads with their own. But they cannot stop the systemic consequence from arriving at your doorstep.
You still get evicted.
Exactly. If a society collectively chooses a path of corruption, environmental degradation, or systemic injustice, the resulting collapse falls on everyone's head.
The elite might have a slightly higher bunker, but they still have to breathe the poisoned air.
This absolutely obliterates the "I was just following orders" defense.
Man, throughout history, foot soldiers of corrupt regimes have tried to claim that the moral and systemic liability belongs to the general who gave the order, not the soldier who pulled the trigger.
In a rational, systems-based view of the universe, a signature from a superior officer does not rewrite the laws of causality.
It just doesn't.
If you execute a flawed, destructive command, the systemic rot that your action creates will eventually destroy the society you live in. You cannot outsource the consequences of your own conduct. Accountability is non-transferable.
Which is a terrifying thought. It means we are completely exposed.
We are.
But at the same time, isn't it incredibly empowering?
How do you mean?
Well, it means your agency actually matters. You aren't just a cog in a machine whose fate is determined by a CEO or a politician. Your refusal to participate in a corrupt system is a real structural act of defiance.
It is the ultimate empowerment.
Mhm.
It centers the individual as the crucial agent of historical change.
But it also means that the individual must be prepared for the reality of what historical change actually looks like.
Yes, and it's not quick.
Which brings us to the final, most profound piece of this diagnostic puzzle: the engine of reason and the long horizon of structural reform. This is where we look at verses 14 and 15 and the story of Noah.
Now, when the average person hears the name Noah, they immediately think of the Sunday school story.
Yeah, a bearded guy, a big wooden boat, marching animals 2 by 2, and a lot of rain. It feels like a myth, a fairy tale.
But remember our methodology today. We are entirely stripping away the sentimental literalism. We are looking at this structurally.
So what's the structural read?
The text mentions a very specific, highly unusual detail about Noah. It says he remained among his people 1,000 years, all but 50, 950 years.
If you read that purely as a biological lifespan, you instantly get bogged down in useless debates about ancient human genetics or magical aging.
It misses the point entirely.
Right, our analytical framework insists on a functional reading of that number.
Exactly. This number, 950 years, is not a biological heartbeat. It models the lifespan of Noah's message, the duration of his civilizational era, and the immensely long horizon of structural reform.
I want to dive deep into the HOW of this. How does a message survive for 950 years? Because that completely redefines what we consider success in changing a society.
It shatters our modern expectations.
We live in a world that is addicted to viral moments. We want overnight disruption. We think that if we get a million retweets or if we elect the right politician, the entire civilization will be healed by next Tuesday.
And when it isn't healed by next Tuesday, we experience massive political and social burnout.
We face that fitnat illness we talked about.
We face the friction of reality, we get discouraged, and we start looking for the jerboa's hidden exit.
We say, well, I tried for a year, it didn't work, the system is rigged, I'm out.
But the text is putting a 950-year timeline on the table. It is saying that changing a society's actual operating system isn't a viral moment. It is the grueling, slow, iterative work of dozens of generations.
Think about the mechanics of how an idea survives that long. It requires building institutional memory.
It requires encoding verified principles into writing systems, into laws, into cultural norms, into the very language a society speaks.
It is like building a medieval cathedral.
That's a brilliant comparison.
The masons who laid the foundation stones knew with absolute certainty that they would be dead 200 years before the spire was finished.
But they laid the stones anyway.
With perfect precision because they understood the long horizon of the project.
That requires a completely different kind of psychological endurance. It means you have to be anchored purely to the verified principle, not to the immediate social reward or the dopamine hit of seeing the finished product.
Which is exactly why the text spent the first half of our deep dive stripping away all those other loyalties.
Ah, it all connects.
Think about the brilliant structural logic here. If you are still intellectually dependent on your parents, you can't build for a future they can't imagine.
Right.
If you are terrified of the crowd, you will abandon the multi-generational project the moment it becomes unpopular.
Yep, you'll take the Nafik.
And if you believe the elites can carry your sins, you will take the easy, corrupt shortcut instead of doing the hard work.
The text had to break those false loyalties to create an agent capable of enduring a 900-year project.
Wow, that is staggering. But we also have to look at the other side of the Noah narrative.
The failure state.
What happens if the society refuses to reform over that long horizon? We have to look at the anatomy of catastrophe, the flood.
The text is very precise in its diagnostic language here. It says the people met the catastrophe while they were wrongdoers.
While they were wrongdoers?
The Arabic concept used for wrongdoing is zulm. And structurally, zulm doesn't just mean being mean or doing a bad thing.
What does it mean systemically?
It means to put something in the wrong place. It is the creation of systemic imbalance.
So the flood isn't just a sudden meteorological event.
The flood is the terminal output of a sustained refusal to correct the system across an entire civilizational span.
It's a mathematical certainty.
If a society spends 950 years engaging in zulm, putting resources in the wrong place, rewarding corruption instead of competence, exploiting the vulnerable, ignoring verified truths, stripping the environment, the system eventually reaches a breaking point.
It is cause-meeting effect at a macro scale.
Precisely. The catastrophe is not a sudden arbitrary punishment from an angry sky. It is the accumulated compound interest of mukafata amal finally coming due.
You cannot ignore a slow, systemic leak in the hull of your civilization for 1,000 years and then act surprised when the ship finally sinks.
The laws of physics, the laws of sociology, eventually assert themselves.
It makes me think of how civilizations actually collapse. It's rarely one big event.
It's a slow rot.
Right. The
Right.
infrastructure degrades, the trust in institutions evaporates, the wealth inequality reaches an unsustainable tipping point.
The load-bearing walls are hollowed out.
And then a minor crisis hits, a drought, a border skirmish, a localized economic panic, and because the system has been weakened by centuries of zulm, the entire structure just disintegrates.
The flood is just the final realization of the rot.
Which is why the text emphasizes that they were destroyed while they were in a state of imbalance.
The catastrophe is the natural mathematical result of the variables the society inputted over generations.
This moves us entirely away from being passive victims of circumstance.
It forces us to recognize that we are the active architects of our own systemic reality.
So, how do we pull all of this together? We've covered massive ground today. We started with the nuclear family and ended with civilizational collapse. What is the grand synthesis of this manual?
The synthesis is about mastering the relationship between permanence and change.
Okay, unpack that.
Over the course of human history, the specific circumstances, the technologies, and the costumes will change. The way your family pressures you today looks very different than it did in an ancient agrarian tribe.
Yeah, my parents aren't carving wooden idols.
Right. And the specific fitnat al-Ness, the pressure of the crowd, might be a viral algorithm and a Twitter mob, instead of a physical mob in the town square.
And the specific "we'll cover for you" bargain from the elites might be a complex financial derivative or a populist political campaign, rather than a straightforward tribal pact.
The stage design changes, but the underlying script of human psychology remains exactly the same.
The structure holds.
Exactly. And because the structure holds, The permanent principles remain clear and unyielding.
Neither biological blood nor the pressure of the crowd can override a verified truth.
Accountability remains fiercely, terrifyingly non-transferable. You alone own the consequences of your action.
And the project of real systemic reform is not a seasonal campaign. It is a multi-generational epoch.
This text is a masterclass in agent hardening. It is a manual for building individuals who can withstand the immense psychological pressure of standing alone on truth.
Individuals who don't build hidden Jerboa exits into their moral commitments.
Individuals who look at a broken system and understand that they alone will carry the weight of their choices.
It's about forging an individual who can look at a 950-year problem, acknowledge the overwhelming scale of the rot, and calmly say, I am willing to lay the first brick of the solution, even knowing I will never see the building finished.
That is the only way civilizations survive.
And that leads me to a final thought I want to leave you with. You listening to this right now.
This is the real question.
We talked earlier about political burnout, about feeling exhausted because the world isn't changing fast enough. But if true civilizational reform takes generations, and the consequences of our actions are entirely our own, are you judging your life's impact on too short of a timeline?
It completely reframes how we measure a successful life.
If you are only looking for the results, the political victories, the social validation that you can physically witness in your own lifetime, are you inadvertently building your life with a hidden exit strategy?
When the pressure comes, when the timeline proves too long for your comfort,
Will you use that hidden tunnel to escape back into apathy? Or are you willing to do the grueling, unglamorous work of building the ark for the next generation? Instead of just comfortably ignoring the leaks in the present one, hoping the ship holds together just long enough for you to get off the stage. Something to think about.